I've been talking the last few weeks about God working things together in our lives for our good. There's a scripture in Romans chapter 8, verse 28. It's probably one of the most famous verses in all the scripture. It says that we know that in all things God works for the good of those that love him and who have been called according to his purpose. Sometimes people say that to you in the midst of a tragedy, and it sounds kind of trite or cliche, and you want to punch them in the face. But it actually is true. And it's true not because everything is good that happens, or even everything feels good, or everything works out immediately for good. But it's true because we have a God who loves us and who is ultimately working things together for our good and his purpose, which is to make us like his son Jesus. And we talked about this a few weeks ago when I talked about my accident and how I fell and the things that people said to me and how I think a lot of times people tend to be simplistic when they think about why things happen. And sometimes it's like, well, God must have done this, or why is God doing this, or whatever. Or they think like, is the enemy attacking me, or it's my own choices, or things just stuff happens. And what I talked about was it's a combination of all those things. And there is a combination of the fact that we make choices, real choices, and our choices matter, and they have impact for good or for evil. My choice to hike, caused me to, have to make certain other choices about, protecting myself from falling on my head, which made me break my feet. We recognize that not everything that happens is from God. Like, though God does cause everything to work together for our good, he doesn't necessarily cause everything that happens. There are other causes. And one of those causes might be the enemy, and Jesus talked about that. He said that the thief comes to steal and kill and destroy, but Jesus has come that we might have life and have it to the full. So there is a power that's opposed to God that's trying to sabotage us, and sometimes there can be evil intent that's against us, and that can be a cause of things. Sometimes there can be our own choices. Sometimes it's just gravity. And in the case of my fall, a big part of it was this thing called gravity, where it's like if you just move in a certain way, you start falling downward. And the laws of nature and the way God has set up nature works in such a way that things happen. And God doesn't necessarily cause all of them, but the overarching factor in all of that is that God, what we call his providence, that God overrules all of those things. God is the one who created a world in where natural laws tend to rule how things work. God created gravity, and gravity works. It doesn't mean that God makes things fall. It means that God created gravity. Gravity makes things fall. There is an enemy, and he hates you, and he's trying to steal, kill, and destroy everything that's good in this world, and sometimes that's a factor. A big factor of everything is our own choices. But ultimately, God, in the midst of that, can take and work things together so that neither our choices, nor our enemy, nor anything else in all creation can separate us from the love of God that's in Christ Jesus and from his ultimate plan for us. And the best story that really explains and kind of almost encapsulates that verse in a narrative form is the story of Joseph. And it's one of my favorite stories in the Old Testament, and it actually takes up a lot of real estate in the book of Genesis. It's like chapter 37 to 50. And so if you've got a Bible, why don't you open it up? And I will not read you all those chapters. I tried to do like 40 chapters of Job or something like last week, and it was a little much. I won't read it all to you this week, but I will start out and read a little bit of it. And if you've got a Bible, why don't you open to Genesis? It's the first book of your Bible, chapter 37. And I'm going to read a little bit, and then I'll just kind of pick up telling you the story. So Genesis 37, starting in verse 2, it says, "This is the account of Jacob." Now, I told you this is Joseph's story. It is Joseph's story. But in the book of Genesis, it tells us this is the account of, and it tells a person's story, but it tells their story by their children. Which those of you that are parents understand this, right? Your life really is told by the story of what happens with your children. And that's the case here with Jacob, and his children tell the story. So Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And he brought their father a bad report about them. Now let me just make an incidental comment. Just because Jacob had multiple wives doesn't mean that the Bible condones that. Just everything the Bible reports isn't necessarily condoning, right? So just a side note, anyway. Now, Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons. Now, Israel is another name for Jacob. Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his old age. And he made a richly ornamented robe for him. And when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. And Joseph had a dream. And when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of the dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream. And of course he told it to his brothers. "Listen," he said, "I had another dream. This time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." Isn't that great? Now, Joseph was an idiot, okay? He obviously had a prophetic gift. He obviously had, amazing gifting to be able to have dreams. And these dreams actually come true. I mean, the things he dreamt about, he had a real legitimate gift, but he didn't have the sense how to use it. And sometimes we can have spiritual gifting beyond our ability to use it because we just don't have the wisdom. And he was a young man, and he was kind of arrogant and kind of dumb in how he used his gift, and it got him into trouble. Again, notice, these are his choices. The dreams were given to him by God, but the choices of how he talked about it was his. And the choice that his father made to favor him over his other brothers and give him a richly ornamented robe, and to create that kind of jealousy. And so when he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him, and he said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow to the ground before you?" And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Now, of course, his brothers were jealous of him. He was favored by his father. His father gave him a robe. He has all these dreams. He's telling his brothers this stuff. He's kind of being a knucklehead about it. And again, these are the choices that Joseph is making. They're his choices. Now, in addition to his choices and the other choices that are around him, his brothers made a choice. And it actually was with evil intent. Kind of goes along with my idea of sabotage and talking about that as one of the causes, although the enemy is not really pegged here in this story as far as the devil being the enemy, but it's more Joseph's brothers that actually have some evil intent toward him. Because of their jealousy, what happens is now Joseph goes and he's out in the field, or his father asks him to go keep an eye on his brothers because he always used to tattle on them, which, again, bad idea. So he goes out to check on his brothers, and his brothers see him coming. And one of his brothers says, "Let's kill him. I've had enough of him." And so they decide that they're going to kill him. And one brother just thinks, "We can't kill our brother. Let's just beat him up and throw him in a pit." And so that's a little nicer. And so they beat him up and they throw him in a pit. And while the one brother that's trying to figure out how to get Joseph out of this is the other brothers are like, "What are we going to do with him?" This guy sees this trading band of caravan of people that are coming from Midian. They ride camels, kind of coming through the desert to go sell stuff down in Egypt. And he says, "Let's just sell him to these traders, and they'll take him as a slave and they'll sell him down in Egypt. And we'll tell Dad that he died. He got mauled by a wild animal. We'll take his coat and soak it in some animal blood and tell Dad that he got killed." And so they did. They took their brother, whom they had already beat up and thrown in a pit, and they sold him as a slave to these traders. And they went back and they told Dad that he was dead. They showed him the coat. They said, "Look, a wild animal must have gotten him. We couldn't find the body." His dad was shattered by this, by the way. And it's interesting that it says this is the story of Jacob, because we know Jacob and Esau and his whole story before that, but this part of the story It's a pretty terrible thing. And I'm sure when it happened and when Jacob is hearing about his son, he's not thinking to himself, wow, I know God's going to work this together for good. No, he was devastated. In fact, we find out later in the story, he was really never the same. He was in mourning. He became very protective and scared about his other son, afraid that he was going to die. It messed him up. And meanwhile, Joseph is on his way down a slave caravan down to Egypt, and he gets down to Egypt and gets sold to a guy named Potiphar. Potiphar's the captain of the guard for the king, Pharaoh. And Joseph gets hired by Potiphar. And the story says that God was with Joseph, and he blessed him in everything that he did. And then it says it again, God was with Joseph, and he blessed him. And it's like, the thing I keep thinking, or what Joseph probably was thinking, is, okay, God, if you're with me, why am I a slave? Why did I get sent into a caravan? Why did my brothers betray me and beat me up? But if God's with you, it doesn't necessarily mean everything goes well for you. He did bless him, and everything went well in his business, but he was still a slave in Egypt. So Joseph's working in Potiphar's house, and it says that Potiphar trusted him so much that he put Joseph in charge of everything. He became a steward of the house. That's where we get the idea of stewardship, because you are taking care of somebody else's stuff. And Joseph was in charge of all Potiphar's stuff, all of Potiphar's money, all of Potiphar's household, all of his servants, and everything that pertained to him. Potiphar said, the only thing, you got everything. You just, I'll just leave him, obviously he didn't, I don't know if he even said this, but you can't have my wife. But the wife wanted Joseph. I don't know, Potiphar was gone a lot, but she had this thing for Joseph. The story says he was young and good looking. He was 17 when he was sold into slavery. He's probably 18, 19 by this time, and she's, maybe 20, I don't know, and she's coming on to him. And he keeps refusing her. He keeps saying, no, I can't do this. I can't sin against the Lord. I can't sin against your master, or my master, your husband. And but she keeps pushing, and one day when she catches him alone, she grabs him by his coat. His coat always seems to be getting him in trouble. I think that's why they made that Joseph in the Technicolor Dreamcoat, play or whatever. But he keeps getting in trouble with the coat. She grabs his coat, and he takes off running, and she yells rape and gets him falsely accused. He ends up getting thrown into prison, which is interesting because if you're the captain of the guard and somebody tries to rape your wife, I don't think prison is the appropriate response normally. I think Joseph probably should have gotten killed if that was what was happening. But I don't know if Potiphar really believed his wife or if he really believed Joseph. But he had to do something, and so he threw Joseph in prison. And I don't think any time while Joseph was sitting in prison, he thought to himself, this is all working together for my good. This is all working right according to plan. I don't think he ever thought that. In fact, he was in prison for a long time, till he was 30. So I don't know what point he got thrown into prison, but he was 17 when he got sold. And so for 13 years, he was a slave or he's in prison. And in prison, the same thing happened that happened in Potiphar's house. Like, God blessed him. God was with him. God gave him favor in the eyes of his master. God made everything succeed that was under him. But he's still in prison. And he one day met a couple of guys that had been on Pharaoh's court. They had been important people, Pharaoh's baker and his cupbearer. The cupbearer is the guy who's kind of like your chief bodyguard because he tastes your cup and guards your cup to make sure that you don't get poisoned. And the baker, I don't know what he did to end up in prison, if he burned the buns or something, but he ends up in prison, and the cupbearer ends up in prison, and they both have dreams. And Joseph had always been having dreams. He had this gifting about dreams, and so he goes, hey, tell me the dreams. I'll see if I can figure them out. And The cupbearer tells him a dream about seeing himself putting a cup in Pharaoh's hand, and the baker tells him a dream about having like a basket of baked goods on his head and birds eating out of the basket. And neither one of them understood their dreams, and so they asked Joseph, and Joseph goes, "Oh, it's easy. I can tell you those dreams. God knows the answer to the dreams." He goes, "Cupbearer, your interpretation's easy. It's like you're going to be back in a few days. You're going to be back putting your cup back in Pharaoh's hand." And he's like, "Awesome." So the baker's like, "All right, well, tell me. Yeah, that one sounded good. How about mine?" And he goes, "Oh, your dream means that Pharaoh's going to bust you out of here in a couple days, and he's going to cut off your head and impale you on a stake, and then the birds are going to eat out where your head was." And he didn't like the interpretation quite as much, but Joseph, again, he still doesn't have tact. But he's straightforward, and he tells these guys. So lo and behold, it happens. These two guys both get called out of prison by the Pharaoh and brought back to Pharaoh. The one guy gets restored to his post as the cupbearer, and the baker gets impaled on a stick and his head cut off, and the birds eat out of his head hole. It's like kind of disgusting. But what Joseph said to this cupbearer before it happened was he said, "Please remember me when you get restored to Pharaoh's." I guess he didn't say "remember me" to the baker because he wasn't going to. It was going to be a short-term memory, right? But he gets restored to the post, and he doesn't remember him. He forgets all about it for a couple years. And so Joseph is still in prison for a couple years. And I think while he's there, he's thinking, the Lord is really working everything together for my good. In the middle of your story, it never seems like it's working together for good. In the middle of the story, it seems like it's all going from bad to worse sometimes. Don't forget that. That's what makes a good story. So finally, after a couple years, Pharaoh has a dream. He comes to... he's frustrated because he had two dreams, and one of them was about like some sheaves of wheat that, these really fat, beautiful, nice, healthy sheaves of wheat, and then these ones that are sick, and there's like 7 of them, and the 7 sick ones come and they eat up the 7 healthy ones, and the healthy ones are gone. And then same thing happens with these cows. There's these nice fat, healthy cows, and some sickly cows come up out of the Nile and eat the healthy cows, and then they don't even get any fatter, the sickly cows don't. And Pharaoh's like just confused and frustrated, and he's having sleepless nights. He can't figure out his dream. He calls all the wise men, everybody he can find, to try to interpret his dream to him. And he can't find anybody that understands what it means. Finally, the cupbearer remembers, there's this guy Joseph. He interprets dreams. He's in the prison. So Pharaoh says, "Well, bring him to me." And so Pharaoh sends for Joseph, and Joseph comes and tells Pharaoh. Pharaoh tells him the dream. And Joseph says, "Well, the Lord got interpretation of dreams. Let me see what I can do." And so Pharaoh tells him the dream, and Joseph goes, "Oh, that's easy. Your dreams are one and the same, and the reason that it was doubled is because it's really sure that this is going to happen. And you need to do something about it. God's warning you ahead of time." And he says, basically what's going to happen is there's going to be 7 really good, years, and the economy's going to do well. The crops are all going to grow, and there's going to be plenty. And then there's going to be 7 years of famine, and they're going to wipe out everything and make it seem like nothing was ever good. And what I think you should do, Pharaoh, is that you should save up, 20% in the good years and put it aside, and so that when the bad years come, then we'll have, some left over. And Joseph was pretty good at economics and this whole thing. So Pharaoh says, "You'll be wise. You're wise. You're wiser than anybody I know. So I'm going to hire you. I want you to be my second in command. I'm going to put you in charge of anything. You're going to be the prime minister of all Egypt, and everything I put into your hand, I'll just sit here on my throne, and you just run the show." And so Joseph all of a sudden has this job, like running the largest economy in the world. And Joseph sat back and he thought, "It's right according to plan. This is exactly how I thought it would be when I sat back and thought, I wonder if I should go to college or if I should go become a slave and then go to prison and work my way up to prime minister, And the thing is, you could never really planned it. Joseph could have really never planned it. But God worked it together for good. And who would have thought? Who would have thought that this kid who was really gifted but not so, wise, would grow in wisdom to the point where he could be put in charge of the largest economy of the world? Well, his career path was unlikely, but he spent some years building his resume, being a slave and being a prisoner. Well, the way the story goes on, the good years come, and there's just plenty. Everything's good in Egypt. Pharaoh gives Joseph a wife. Joseph was around 30 years old when he started working for Pharaoh. So he had been in either a slave or in prison for 13 years. He's working for Pharaoh now, and the 7 good years come. He saves up a lot. They create lots of storage barns, all this stuff. And then the bad years start. And the first year that the bad stuff happens, everybody is, caught off guard except for Joseph. They've got plenty of, and Egypt, they've got plenty of stuff, the government does. And so Joseph says, what I think you should do now that the people are hungry, they're going to come to you and they're going to ask for food. You should trade it for their land. And so Joseph kind of works this deal. He says, I've done the commodities market, now I'm going to get into real estate. And he ends up taking over pretty much all the real estate in Egypt because he trades so people can have food to eat and they become slaves on their own land. And then as the economy gets, worse and the whole region is bad, now he starts an international trade. And people are coming from all over, from nations all around the surrounding nations because they don't have any food. And they're coming to Joseph to buy food. And so now, guess who shows up? Joseph's brothers. Because they were up in Israel and things are not going well and they're having a famine. And so now all of a sudden they are coming down to ask for help from Egypt because they heard that there's grain in Egypt. Now they know nothing of Joseph. They thought he was, gone long ago. They sold him into slavery and it's been it was 13 years and then 7. So it's at least 20 years, 20 something years that Joseph's been gone. But Joseph recognizes his brothers. He sees them come and they don't recognize him. I don't know, because he has one of those gold pharaoh hats and like a pointy beard or something. I don't know what they look like exactly, but he looked more like an Egyptian than like a Hebrew. And the brothers come and Joseph has his opportunity. He has his opportunity to get even, to just really, get his revenge, but he doesn't. In fact, there's kind of a back and forth thing that happens where Joseph wants to kind of find out if his brothers have had a change of heart or if they even remember him. And so he kind of puts them to some tests and kind of does this thing where, he kind of tricks them to where he's listening. They don't know that he knows Hebrew because he always speaks in Egyptian. And he overhears them saying, because he says, you've got to go back and get your youngest brother and then bring him back here because I want to have all your brothers together. And they say, we can't bring our youngest brother here. Like, he's the baby, and he's the only one our father has left because our father already lost our other brother, and, it would kill our father, and we can't do this. And one of the brothers offers himself instead of his brother, and Joseph realizes that they've had this change of heart, but he, goes through with saying, no, you got to go bring this brother back. And so he keeps the one brother as collateral to make him go back and bring back the youngest brother, Benjamin. And he says, bring your father here too, because Joseph wants to see his father. But these guys still don't know who Joseph is. So they leave the one brother there, but they go back, and they're, the father says, there's no way I'm bringing the younger brother here. I've already lost my one son. I'm not going to lose the other son. We'll starve to death, whatever. And so they try to get on without going back, and they leave the other brother there until finally, it gets so bad that the father just says, whatever, go ahead, I'll just die, take the boy. And, the father's pretty depressed by this point, but he just says, go. And so they do. They bring Benjamin, the youngest brother. They come back, and, Joseph finally reveals himself. And I love this line where he finally does this. It's in chapter 40. No, sorry, chapter 45. And in chapter 45, it says this: Joseph could no longer, this is verse 1. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before his attendants, and he cried out, have everyone leave my presence. And there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him. And Pharaoh's household heard about it. And Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still living? But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Wouldn't you be? Then Joseph said to his brothers, come close to me. And when they had done so, he said, I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there's been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will not be plowing or reaping. But God has sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God. It wasn't God that threw Joseph in a pit. And it wasn't God that told Joseph's brothers to throw Joseph in a pit. In fact, Joseph's brothers throwing him in a pit and then selling him into slavery was directly contrary to God's will. God has revealed his will. You shall love your brother. You shall treat him well. You don't throw him in a pit and you don't sell him into slavery. You don't lie to his father and you don't tell him to kill him. All of the things the brothers did were contrary to God's will. But in spite of the evil choices of people and the sabotage of evil choices and just the natural consequences of things that happen in the course of life, God was working all of it together somehow, not just for Joseph's good, but for the good of the whole family and for saving not just these brothers in this family, but the whole world at the time through Joseph. God used it. God worked it all together for Joseph's good. And the way Joseph saw it, he said, look, don't even be mad at yourselves about this. Joseph forgave his brothers because he said, look, God sent me here. So then it was not you who sent me here, but God. And so then he kissed his brothers and he wept over them. So he talked to his brothers and he finally, now Pharaoh and all the Egyptians heard all the weeping and crying and they're like, what the heck's going on? And so they basically said, they found out and Joseph told them the whole story about his brothers and all this. And he said, well, bring them, like have them move here. Go get your father and bring them back and we'll give you whatever land you want. We'll give you a place to live. And so Joseph's brothers went back. They got the dad. They brought him back. Joseph got to have this reunion with his father. He got to be there when his father died. It was a really great ending to a really bad story. And a beautiful picture of reconciliation and healing and forgiveness and all that God can do to restore a family. But look at the way it ends in the story in chapter 50. As soon as Jacob dies, it says verse 15 of chapter 50, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, what if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did him? So they sent word to Joseph saying, your father left us these instructions before he died. This is what you're to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers for the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father. So the brothers make up this story about, hey, dad says, forgive your brothers. And it says, when Joseph heard their message, he wept. And his brothers came and threw themselves down before them and said, we're your slaves. But Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done in saving many lives. God intended it for good. Even in the evil things that people may do, even in the stupid choices that we may make, even in the tragic events that may happen to us in life, God means for good. And he will work it together for our good. And he will use it not just for our good, but for the good of others. And so the thing is that I think about this story, and when I look at Joseph, and I look at so many people that I've talked to lately that are just going through incredibly terrible and even tragic circumstances. don't judge your story until the credits roll. You know? In the middle of the story, it may not look like God's working everything together or even that he likes you. But please don't just read your story and make an assessment right in the middle of it. You kind of need to wait till the end, because you very rarely see how God's working things together for good in the middle of it. First time I had experienced any tragedy, I've lost a lot of people in my life, and we've had several different things that have gone on, but the first time we really experienced anything tragic was Tracy and I were in our early 20s, and I was working at Coast Hills Church, and she had gotten pregnant, and we were excited. We were probably 23, and we were so excited that we were going to have a baby. We told our parents and her parents and told everybody at the church, and then she had a miscarriage. And for those of you that have had miscarriages, even though it was an early miscarriage, like the pain of losing the baby is not just losing a baby, but losing all the dreams of what you envisioned and what you hoped for with that baby. So even if for those of you that have struggled with infertility, there's that pain of that loss. On the heels of that, 2 weeks later, we had a junior high camp. I was a junior high pastor at the church, and we were on our way up to camp, and we had 3 buses. And when I got to the camp a little early, Tracy and there were a bunch of girls on this one bus that didn't get there yet. And the camp director called me and said, "Hey, is your last bus here yet?" And I said, "No, why?" And he said, "Well, because a bus with about 33 people, a white bus with about 33 people, just went off the viewpoint over Palm Springs and burst into flames." And I lost it. And in the moment, I was going, "God, okay, you took my baby, now you took my wife, and all these kids that I'm responsible for." And this is how I felt, Not saying that God did that again, but it is a lot of times how people feel, like, "God, what are you doing?" As if God's doing it. But actually what did the bus crash was that the driver from the bus company, not one of our youth leaders, was smoking crack on the way up while he's driving the bus. And evidently, one of the laws of nature is that if you smoke crack, you don't drive a bus very well. And so he drove off onto the side of the road on the shoulder, and when he hit the soft shoulder, the bus tumbled and had rolled over 1.5 times and slid down kind of a long embankment. It wasn't like a cliff at the viewpoint of Palm Springs like they told me originally. Like the person had as much tact as Joseph, who told me that, I think, right? But the bus had rolled over and the oil had spilled on the engine and it started smoking. The bus driver woke, kind of came to and ended up pulling a bunch of people to safety. A rock had stopped the bus from sliding down further, and 100 yards, farther or farther back, and it would have been a cliff. But the crazy point was that at the end of this, when all of the paramedics and the emergency people came, they were actually laughing because they're like, "This is so awesome. We just practiced this like 4 days ago." And I guess they had just done, like, their whole mountain rescue people had done a simulation, but it was with a Girl Scout bus, and it was like 150 yards away from the actual spot where it happened. But it was with the exact same number. And so just Girl Scouts versus youth group, same deal. They were all girls. And so these guys were like, "This is awesome. I can't believe we just practiced this." And so nobody ended up dying. And there were some injuries, but even in the midst of all of this, what we didn't see at the time, which seemed like the most tragic, horrible thing in the world, but the bus company paid for pretty much all those girls to go to college and all the leaders to have down payments for houses. And so that was kind of nice. God working things out for good. But somehow in all of that, like in the middle of it, we didn't see that. And then 2 weeks after that, I was at another junior high event, and Tracy wasn't feeling well. She'd stayed home, and we found out she had to have emergency surgery because the pregnancy that we thought she had miscarried was still in her fallopian tube, and her fallopian tube was going to rupture, and she had to have an emergency surgery for an ectopic pregnancy. And And so all this while, all of these things, I'm in the midst of this and going, okay, why, God? And what's going on? And why is it thing after thing after thing? Doesn't it always seem like when things come, like a lot of them come at once? Like I think, I don't know, I see that in a lot of situations with people. But in the middle of it, you don't feel like, God, what are you doing? But here's the thing, as I look back, it wasn't until about a year and a half later that I realized Tracy got pregnant with Zach, our oldest, 3 months after that event. And not only was it a miracle that she got pregnant with all the scar tissue in her fallopian tube and everything else, but I just think about Zach and him being born, and I think, like, this baby probably would have been awesome, whoever that baby was, but like it wouldn't have been Zach. And he would have never been born. And so as I look at my story in the midst of times where I'm having a difficult time or where things don't seem to be going well or I'm in the middle of the story, it's like I got to keep remembering, you know what? Don't judge the story until the credits roll. You know, I don't see it all. I don't have the perspective. You know, like my accident. If I hadn't have been in that accident, I would have been in Italy and had a great vacation in Italy this summer, and then I would have been home and surfing and running and doing all this awesome stuff. See, but I'm too close to it to judge right now, right? Don't judge the story until you get to the end of it. I'm sure someday I'll look back, but resist the temptation to interpret your story right in the middle of the conflict. I love this saying. I think it's Bill Johnson that said this, but it's one of my favorite things because, you know, the scripture says that God's working everything together for our good. And so it works out for good in the end. And so if it's not good, it's not the end. So you can know, like, if you're in the middle of it and it's not good, it must not be the end. Because it works together for good in the end. Now, some of you may be saying, okay, wait, but what about for people that die? Like, it's not good. like I lost somebody, or it doesn't seem like it's getting better. Or like, what if it doesn't end good in your particular story? And I've been thinking about that, and I think that one of the great things about the Joseph story and all the Old Testament is everything that's written in the Old Testament really points to Jesus. Jesus told us that that's the way to interpret all of it ultimately. In Luke 24, he says basically it's all about him. And this Joseph story is about Jesus too. Because, you know, though we can look at Joseph's story and we can go, look how God worked everything together for Joseph, it didn't all work out the same for everybody in that story. There were some people that were dealing with the famine. You know, and there were other people in other situations, but God saved people through Joseph. Joseph was the one through whom his brothers were saved. In fact, Joseph went ahead of his brothers because they sold him into slavery. They, for a price of silver, sold him into slavery. But Joseph, you know, said, God meant it for good. Just as Jesus was sold for silver, but he's the one that said in John 14, he said to his brothers the night before he was to be crucified, he said, I'm going to prepare a place for you. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. But I'm going to prepare a place for you that you may be with me where I am. Now, just stick with me for a second. Jesus is the one better than Joseph who has gone before us, through whom many lives will be saved, and who has gone before to prepare a place for us. Just as Joseph prepared a place so that all of his brothers could be saved and so that his family could come to Egypt, Jesus has gone before us. He has prepared a place that ultimately, even if your story doesn't feel like it ends well in this life isn't the only part of the story. The story goes on and it goes beyond this life. And so it all works out for good in the end. I've read, in fact, the end of this book. And in the end, it says, I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. And I saw the holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, now the dwelling of God is with men, and he will live with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them and will be their God, and he will wipe every tear from their eyes, and there will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. And he who is seated on the throne said, I am making everything new. And he said, write this down, because these words are trustworthy and true. He is making everything new. He has gone ahead to prepare a place. And even though, it was by our hand and for our sake that he was betrayed, and ultimately that he gave his life for us, he has done it to prepare a place for us, not just in this life, but in the life to come. And it ends good. It works out good in the end. And so if it's not good yet, it's not the end yet. So pray with me. God, I thank you. Thank you for your goodness. I thank you for your ability to play chess with whatever our choices and the enemy and the world and the just course of nature throws at you, that you always have the upper hand, that you always get the upper hand, and that you always work everything together for our good. Thank you. God, I pray for your comfort for those that are suffering. I pray for those that feel like they're in the middle of a dark time, that they would have courage to know that it's not the end of their story and you're not finished yet and that you love them. And so, God, I pray that you would draw people close to your heart, that you would give them courage and encouragement, and that you continue to work things together for our good and for your glory. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.